listener production. Hello, happy Friday and welcome to The Briefing. I'm Sasha Barbagat. Have you ever wondered who gets to decide how much we pay for petrol? In the second half of this episode, we explain why fuel can be so damn expensive at one servo, but then you drive a minute down the road and it's 60 cents cheaper.
They're not expecting motorists to do that research and go, you know what, before I even get in the car, I'm going to go find where that 164 servo is and I'm going to drive past the 220 servo. If we can get that to change more, then I think we've really turned the tables on the oil companies.
That one's by Bension Siebert, but first, it is time for the Friday headlines with Chris Spiro on Friday, January 24th.
Morning, Sash. Morning, everybody, and happy Friday. The Prime Minister will be making a major election promise today, guaranteeing apprentices a 10 grand bonus if he wins this year's vote. Anthony Albanese will speak at the National Press Club, promising the $626 million incentive for tradies who choose to go into the construction sector. It's designed to try to boost the workforce amid chronic labour shortages and a desperate need for new homes, Sash.
The sector has been set a goal of building 1.2 million new properties by 2030 by Labor. Labor has set this goal not only for the sector but for itself as well. Now, this will be the party's first major election pitch of the year, with the PM expected to focus heavily on skills, infrastructure and cost of living relief in this speech today. So who would be eligible for this? Bricklayers, electricians, plumbers, carpenters and joiners are among those who'll be able to tap into that little incentive. So this will kick in from July this year, shortly after the election is expected, and apprentices will receive $2,000 at the 6, 12, 24 and 36-month marks of their apprenticeship, as well as at the completion of their training. Look, something else that's happened in politics in the last day or so. Now, you might remember we spoke about this on Monday. Peter Dutton and the Coalition made this big announcement on Sunday that they were going to give tax breaks to small businesses who take out their staff or their clients for hospitality, so taking them out for a meal or something similar. So Labor has taken a big swipe at that. They've said it's akin to using taxpayer money to shout your boss a steak tartare. It was reported on Thursday that this policy could also extend to things like football games, golf rounds and movie days for staff and clients. So that's an interesting one. Meantime, Peter Dutton still hasn't told us how much this idea would cost or exactly what would be covered.
To the UK now, where a teenager who stabbed 3 young girls to death at a Taylor Swift-themed dance class last July has been sentenced to 52 years in prison. 18-year-old Axel Rudakabana is responsible for the deaths of 6-year-old BB King, 7-year-old Elsie Stankham, and 9-year-old Alice De Silva Aguirre. He was also sentenced over the attempted murder of 10 others, the judge explaining while technically eligible for parole after 52 years, he is unlikely to ever be released, saying she couldn't impose a life sentence as he was 17 at the time. During the trial, CCTV footage was played showing the young attacker entering the dance studio in Southport in England's northwest. It was inside that he, armed with a large kitchen knife, lunged at a group of children making friendship bracelets and singing Taylor Swift songs on their first day of summer break, Sash.
Yeah, the attack shocked the country, triggering nationwide anti-immigrant riots. Now, these were seized upon by the country's far right, which ran with incorrect reports that he was an asylum seeker who had recently arrived in the UK. But Rudakabana was born in Wales to Christian parents from Rwanda. Now, he was known to police for his history of violence long before this attack last July, and he'd actually been referred to the country's anti-extremist program 3 times before. Now, interestingly, a little connection to Australia with this story, Chris, is that prosecutors say he'd been researching atrocities that had been committed by others that were similar, these sort of knife attacks that he set out to emulate. Before he left home, he searched social media for a video of the stabbing of the Sydney bishop, Marmari Emmanuel, which had taken place a couple of months earlier. Now, the reason I find that quite interesting is that the Australian government had tried to get this taken off X because the uncensored footage was being posted all over the platform and the government and X got into a legal battle over it about, and now it's become a thing about censorship. But this is the Australian government's point, is that these sort of videos in the wrong hands can radicalise somebody.
Changing pace now, sad news for Aussie music fans with Splendour in the Grass cancelled for a second year running. The event's organisers posted the news to socials yesterday, Arvo, telling followers they were still working on bringing the event back bigger and better when the time is right. According to sources though, the main reason was that they couldn't lock in any big international headliners for 2025.
Splendour was called off last year after slow ticket sales. Arcade Fire, Kylie Minogue and G-Flip were named as headliners in 2024. Great all individually, but a Splendour headliner, I don't know. The event in its heyday used to sell out in literal minutes and has welcomed some of the biggest names to its northern New South Wales home, including Kanye West, Coldplay, Kendrick Lamar, Florence and the Machine and Lorde. So yeah, I can kind of understand why G-Flip as a headliner wasn't really bringing the sales like Kendrick or Coldplay were. And look, while we're on pop culture, the Oscar nominations have dropped this morning. Now, the announcement was postponed twice because of the LA fires. We now know Emilia Perez is leading the nods with 13, followed by Wicked and The Brutalist, which both got 10 each.
Yeah, as for the Aussies, Guy Pearce is our main hope, up for Best Supporting Actor for his role in The Brutalist. Missing out, though, is early award season favourites Angelina Jolie for her portrayal of opera singer Maria Callas, one of my people, a Greek opera singer there. Nicole Kidman in Baby Girl and Pamela Anderson, The Last Showgirl. So they were major shock exclusions from the list. And look, the 97th Academy Awards will take place on March the 2nd in Hollywood. For us, that is March the 3rd, starting at around 10 a.m.
And the Women's Australian Open final has been decided, with Aryna Sabalenka going for a third straight title after defeating Paula Badoza. Now, it was a bittersweet win for the Belarusian because she's good mates with her opponent.
I'm sure she hate me for the next, hour, day two. I'm okay with that. I can handle that. And after that, I think we're back to be friends, back to go out together, shopping. I promise, if she's going to watch it, I promise Paula we go shopping and I pay for whatever she wants.
Be friends with Aryna Sabalenka. That audio was thanks to Nine. She will play Madison Keys in the decider tomorrow after the American won through in an instant classic against Iga Swiatek.
And as for the men, their semis are tonight. Novak Djokovic is playing Alexander Zverev and Yannick Sinner takes on Ben Shelton. And look, just sticking with Sabalenka, I saw this really, really cute footage of her going after the match and consoling her opponent and friend. And it was really nice. She was like patting her on the back and they were chatting. It was really heartwarming. And if she does win, she will be the first player since Martina Hingis to claim a three-peat of titles at Melbourne Park. So I don't know, this weekend is going to be a great one for tennis fans.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, it is a long weekend for a lot of people across the country. Australia Day is on Sunday. You might be taking the public holiday on the Monday. Whatever you get up to, we will be here with another deep dive on Monday morning and headlines from the Listener Newsroom team. Chris, thank you. Next up, we have our deep dive with Bension Siebert, looking at why the hell petrol prices are so weird and so expensive.
Hey, Bension here. Petrol prices are crazy. Not crazy because they're really, really expensive, although in many places they are right now. More, you're crazy, girl. Like, why is the price at one petrol station vastly more expensive than at another petrol station just down the road? Why, even at two petrol stations of the same company in the same city, is one offering a great deal while the other is being a huge jerk? On top of that, who or what is to blame when fuel prices go up pretty much everywhere? Is it the government? Is it oil barons somewhere in the Middle East? And is it fair when, for example, Russia invaded Ukraine, for the Australian government to say, not my fault, look over there? Who actually has the power here? Who actually decides on the price? And what is the best way to fuel up cheaply? One man who knows the answers to each of these questions and more is Peter Khoury. He's a spokesperson for the National Roads and Motorists Association, which is Australia's biggest member-owned roadside assistance and motorist advocacy group. Peter, welcome to the briefing.
Thank you for having me on.
Right now, according to petrolspy.com, the most expensive petrol in Victoria is being sold for $2.26 at a petrol station in Footscray. If you walk literally 100 metres down the road, another petrol station is selling unleaded for $1.64. 62 cents difference. What the hell is going on here? Can you explain it to me?
Yeah. Well, welcome to filling up in Australia. Unfortunately, or fortunately, if you manage to fill up at the $1.60 servo and not the $2.20 servo, the reality that we face in this country, no matter where you live, is that prices aren't regulated and there's nothing stopping service stations from charging whatever they want. And clearly from that example, they obviously do, and then some. And that plays out every day in every town, suburb and city in the country. You consistently see massive spreads of prices between the cheapest and most expensive service stations. As we speak, in Sydney, it's 56 cents a litre between the cheapest and the most expensive servo. Welcome to the Bowser at Australia.
Can I give you just one more example? Because this kind of breaks my brain. You've got an Ampol petrol station in Sydney, $2.16. You've got another Ampol petrol station in Sydney, maybe 1-2 minutes drive down the road for $1.64. Like, why are even the same companies selling petrol at wildly different prices?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And now we're going to start to focus more on what happens locally in local neighbourhoods. And so with Ampol, for example, I would suspect that those prices were taken at the snapshot when the price cycle in Sydney was just about to turn or had already turned. So what would happen is that you would see those prices very low Ampol at one place, significantly more expensive than another place. And it's not just Ampol, mind you, this happens with all of them. The 164 just hasn't turned their price up yet because the price cycle was turning. The other one has. Now, I suspect that might be what is playing out there, because to be that close geographically, it can't really have been anything else. So we're assuming that that's what that is. But again, highly volatile market, so it could be something else, but that certainly is what that looks like.
Who actually sets the price at the pump? Is it the owner of that one business? Could they be a franchise, for example, of Ampol that decides independently? Who's making the decision?
First of all, there is your local independent service station, and as the name suggests, it's a small business. So it's owned by one operator. That owner might have one service station. They may have more, but they're an independent. They look like an independent. They will ultimately decide what price they're going to set. They tend to be cheaper. Then you start to go into the larger brands in Australia, your Ampols, your BPs, your Shells. Most of those are owned by the corporation brand. There are some franchised service stations under those brands, particularly with BP, but those prices tend to be set by head office, and they tend to look at a number of factors. One of them is, where is that service station located geographically? Is it in a part of a city, a big city where there's lots of independents and lots of competition around, in which case they will try to be a bit more competitive, but often it can be the case that they tend to be more expensive.
If you see a petrol station on the side of the road that's selling for $1.60 or something, and then you see one a bit further on that's selling much more expensive, are they just exploiting the fact that it's annoying to do a U-turn?
So they're exploiting two things. One could be that it's annoying to do a U-turn, and obviously illegal, depending on where you're driving. And the other is, I think they rely on people filling up on habit. And that's what we're trying to break at the NRMA. In fact, we've been working for years at that very thing. And so what we're trying to get the public to get used to is using the data that's available now to them in real time, pretty much everywhere in Australia, except for Victoria, although thankfully this week the government's announced in Victoria that they're going to take on the advice of the NRMA and change that. But they are banking on people using habit to fill up. They're not expecting motorists to do that research and go, you know what, before I even get in the car, I'm going to go find where that 164 servo is, and I'm going to drive past the 220 servo. If we can get that to change more, then I think we've really turned the tables on the oil companies.
Without getting too technical, I think people would love to know who to blame when they fill up and it's so much money. From pulling the oil out of the ground to getting it into your car, what are the factors that affect the price along that journey?
So it's going to be difficult to do this without being too technical, but there are
I have faith, Peter. You can do it.
So let's take a trip overseas. We start there.
Yeah, sure.
Because all of our fuel pretty much is now coming from overseas. So we rely on nations overseas, oil-producing countries to produce most of our fuel that we put in the vehicle. Increasingly now, so they will drill the oil. They will send that oil to refineries, very large refineries in Asia, who then turn that oil into fuel. And then we import that fuel into terminals, and that goes into the service stations and into the bowsers that we then buy. So we produce some oil in Australia, but not a lot. We used to have 8 refineries in Australia, which meant that we used to just either refine our own oil or import unrefined oil and refine it here, turn it into petrol. But we've gone from having 8 refineries down to 2. So now we overwhelmingly import pretty much everything we put into our cars. So I hope that kind of gives a sense of what it takes to get the fuel here. Before it gets here, there's a number of factors which will determine how much we pay for that oil and then how much we pay for the refined product, the fuel. And we have zero control over all of these. And I'll give you an example. So you've had the newly elected Trump administration sworn in this week. Donald Trump has announced that he's going to increase drilling. America's already producing record levels of oil and fuel, but they're going to increase it even more. That put downward pressure on the price. Donald Trump then announced he's going to increase sanctions on Iran, which is an oil-producing country. That put upward pressure on the price. The previous Biden administration increased its sanctions on Russia. Russia is one of the world's largest producers of oil. That put upward pressure on prices. The whole world is waiting to see what happens with the Chinese economy because China is the world's largest importer of oil. So that can have a huge effect on price. So this is before we've even gotten to Australia. And if all of that doesn't make you want to walk into the ocean, I'm not sure what would. We have to look at the strength of the Australian dollar because oil is traded globally on US dollar terms. So the stronger the Aussie dollar, not only is that good if you're going overseas for a holiday, but it is also good for drivers because it means we're getting more for our buck when we import oil. We pay tax on the fuel here in Australia, the fuel excise. We pay GST on that tax, and that tax is now 50 cents a litre, and it goes up twice a year, and then you add 10% onto that for the GST. And then on top of all of that, you've got the local oil companies in Australia who put their prices up and down based on these price cycles that we have in cities, in the major cities that we live in. And that also adds an added element to what sort of prices we're going to pay at the bowser. I hope that wasn't too technical, but that is just a snapshot of what we have to look at every day when we try to work out whether we're getting ripped off or not.
If you're a petrol station in Hobart or Brisbane or Sydney, are you getting the petrol at more or less the same price before you sell it to the consumer, or are they getting wildly different prices?
So we have what we call the terminal gate price, which is the wholesale price. So that's the price that the oil companies get the fuel at, and then they will obviously add their profit on top of that. And so there are small variations from city to city, what that wholesale price is or what that terminal gate price is, but they're not huge. And so you can look with a degree of confidence at the terminal gate price of regular unleaded in Sydney today, for example, which is once $1.72, and you can be, that's pretty close to the mark. So Hobart would be similar, Brisbane would be similar.
Are we all just having a bit of a sook about petrol prices in Australia, or are they actually high by international standards?
I don't think we're having a sook. I think they're higher than they should be, but not necessarily on international standards. And hear me out. So we pay a fair bit of tax on our fuel compared to, say, the United States, which doesn't pay anywhere near as much tax as we do. But compared to the Europeans, we pay less, and compared to New Zealand, we pay less. So Australian motorists pay less for fuel than they do in the United States, which is probably the closest benchmark for us, because if you think geographically about what the United States looks like and how far they drive in America, you think about the type of cars they drive and compare them to the fleet in Australia, then that's probably the closest benchmark. But we certainly pay less than the UK, most of Western Europe, New Zealand. But again, different fleet of vehicles over there. They don't tend to drive as far. Their roads are built differently to ours. So we're kind of That's why we try not to make comparisons too much to what's going on overseas, because there are domestic factors, namely tax, which has a big impact on that. But that's not to say that we're sooks. I think there is definitely fat in some of the prices in Australia.
You mentioned the excise and the tax, but petrol always becomes a political issue. Is it fair to blame the government when it goes up or thank the government when it goes down?
Well, the excise never goes down. It went down once. The previous Morrison government cut it by half for 6 months when we were facing by far the highest oil prices globally. After COVID, when at that period of time when the world was coming out of COVID, coming out of lockdown, people were moving around again and demand for oil spiked, and it was much greater than supply. And then on top of that, Russia invaded Ukraine. So we saw record prices, and it was in that environment that the Morrison government cut the excise by half for, I think it was 6 months. And fuel is the only commodity outside of cigarettes and alcohol that we pay a tax on a tax. So that's certainly something we could potentially look at. But the point the NRMA has made all along is that the fuel excise is there for a reason. It's there for governments to then fund, or government, because it's collected by the feds and then distributed to the states, to fund road upgrades and road maintenance. And that's really important because now you're starting to delve into road safety issues, and it's about saving lives.
Recently, and I think you mentioned this, the Victorian government made some announcements about how they want to manage the way that petrol works in Victoria. One of those is that the price won't be able to change more than once in 24 hours. The other is publicly reporting fuel price changes. The second one seems pretty obvious, but why is no change within 24 hours important? And is that something that should be rolled out elsewhere?
In terms of locking in the prices for 24 hours, there are a couple of benefits. One of them is that once you've locked in your price, you can't put it back up again for 24 hours. You can, however, drop it. So we hope to see some downward movement over that period when service stations realise that, I'm charging massive overs and I want to be more competitive today, so I'll drop my price. What it also does is we hope, and we're waiting to see, is it will discourage servos from chasing the highest price. And so what you tend to see with these price cycles is that the price goes up. Some servos will jump really quickly, like they'll go from $1.60 to $2 and something, and then the others follow. So we're hoping it will disrupt that behaviour and then hopefully keep prices lower a bit longer. So looking to see what happens. Big announcement from the Victorian government in the middle, of course, of a cost of living crisis. So we're pleased that we finally got them over the line on that policy.
What are your top tips to save money on petrol?
Research. So the top tip for saving money on petrol is definitely do your research. There are some things that the NRMA have been doing to try and help families. And so, you mentioned Ampol before. If you're an NRMA member and you fill up at most Ampols in Australia participating in this program, but we partnered with Ampol so you can get a discount of up to 13 cents a litre. But most importantly, we provide real-time prices for every service station across the country. There's a variation of Victoria, of course, because we're waiting to see what happens with that legislation, but we can give people the information they need on the NRMA app. So before you go and fill up, you just get on your phone for 30 seconds, not please while you're behind the wheel, do it before you drive off, and you can plot your journey and find the cheapest servos. And so if we can't stop one servo charging $1.64 and another charging $2.20 within a few hundred metres of each other, what we can do is give the public the information they need to find that $1.64 servo, because it's a saving of over $30 if you fill up at the cheap one and not the expensive one on a full tank of gas. And I don't know any Australian right now who would turn their nose up at a $30 saving on a full tank of petrol.
Well, Peter Khoury, thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Cheers.
Peter Khoury from the National Roads and Motorists Association there. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Briefing. That's it for now. Before you'd go, we'd love it if you could share this app with someone you think might enjoy it. It's a really easy way you can support us and all we do here at The Briefing. So is sharing our socials posts. Check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on TikTok and YouTube. Search Listener Newsroom. The Briefing is made by Helen Smith, Chris Spiru, Sasha Barbagat and me, Bension Siebert. Audio imaging by Chris Marsh and Darcy Thompson. The Briefing's executive producer is Jessica Wukyanov. Thanks for joining us and see you next time.